interesting class on economics. My name is Vanessa Hart. The topic for today's class is economic development challenges. And the theme for this topic is applied economics and contemporary economic organizations. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the following development challenges: debt burden, debt relief, poverty alleviation and eradication, epidemic diseases, power and energy supply, and finally, resource control and corruption. Every nation of the world has the potential for economic, political, and social development. Oftentimes, they are unable to meet up these potentials. Most countries that have achieved economic stability have aggressively invested in human capital development and leadership. For third world countries, which are developing countries that have not realized some level of economic and political stability, they are faced with issues of high rates of unemployment, rising debt profile, increasing poverty rates, and high mortality rates. This is because they have not invested in human capital development and leadership as the developed countries have done. Now let's look at what economic development is about. Economic development can be defined as an improvement in the economic, political, and social well-being of a people. It is seen as a progress in an economy. In a country that is developed economically, most of its citizens are healthier, wealthier, well-educated, and happier. For as long as Nigeria's independence in 1960, Nigeria has desired to achieve development but has been faced with a number of issues. Now let's look at these economic development challenges that Nigeria has faced. Economic development challenges refer to those factors that hinder the improvement in the social, economic, and political well-being of a people. These factors include poverty, unemployment, power and energy inadequacy, corruption and resource control, high mortality rates, and finally, debt burden and debt relief. Now let's look at these factors in detail. Poverty. Presently, statistics have shown that there are about 86.9 million people who live in extreme poverty in Nigeria. Poverty is a situation whereby people do not have enough resources to meet up their basic needs. Remember that the basic needs of man are food, clothing, and shelter. When people are not able to meet up their basic needs, it affects the productivity of a nation and consequently causes insecurity. Now let's look at how poverty can be alleviated. Poverty alleviation refers to a set of guidelines or plans intended by the government to help improve the economic status of those said to be living in extreme poverty. In 2001, the National Poverty Eradication Program, NAPEP, was established by the Nigerian government to curb the increasing rate of poverty in Nigeria. Now let's look at the methods involved in poverty eradication and alleviation. Over time, various methods have been put in place in order to reduce poverty to the barest minimum. One of such methods is the provision of healthcare, food, and water. Many programs aim at providing healthcare, water, and food, especially for children, that is school children. In 2018, the federal government began to provide food for school children in order to encourage them to come to school. This also aids economic development. Next, we have education and trainings in vocational trades and internships. Quality education and training empowers people for jobs and businesses so that they can meet up their basic needs. Now let's look at the next one, income redistribution. The problem of misappropriation of funds and unequal distribution has caused most people to remain impoverished. The state and local governments must look into it by distributing funds appropriately so that it can aid economic development in these regions. Now let's look at the second economic development challenge, unemployment. This is a situation whereby individuals who are willing and able to work are unable to find a job. Unemployment or a loss of job can pose an adverse effect on an economy. This is because there is a reduction in consumer spending, which also affects production and businesses. In 1986, the National Directorate of Employment was established by the Nigerian government to reduce the rate of unemployment in Nigeria. Now let's look at the third challenge, which is epidemic diseases. Epidemic diseases such as Ebola, HIV/AIDS, and tuberculosis lead to increased spending on healthcare and loss of income. In 2014, the first case of the Ebola virus was reported in Nigeria, but for the quick intervention of the Nigerian government, the disease was contained. Epidemic diseases are economic development challenges because they cause a reduction in labor force and skilled labor. Now let's look at the next one, inadequate power supply. Lack of power supply cripples the various sectors of the economy. This is because people will be unable to carry out their economic activities and businesses as usual because of the inadequacy in power supply. Now let's look at the next one, resource control. This simply refers to the way in which government revenue is shared among the various tiers of government for the purpose of economic development. Now, these tiers of government include the federal, the state, and the local government. Oftentimes, it is seen that people in control of these resources are the greatest beneficiaries, whereas those below do not receive as much as they are supposed to get. This impedes or stops them from achieving economic development. Now let's look at the next challenge, which is corruption. Corruption is said to be when people take advantage of the positions they occupy in order to engage in fraudulent activities or embezzlement of funds. In Nigeria, for example, there have been a lot of charges on political office holders who have been involved in fraudulent activities or embezzlement of funds. This has also been a major setback in the nation's quest for sustained development. Now let's look at the next economic challenge, which is debt burden. A debt burden is a large sum of money which a country or organization owes another, which they find very difficult to repay. They find it difficult to repay because if a greater portion of their resources is used to pay debts, they will have little or nothing for economic development. Now let's look at the last economic challenge, which is debt relief. This is a partial or total forgiveness of debts, especially those owed by developing countries to external creditors. Some countries take advantage of these debt reliefs because of their awareness of more aids. But for good institutions, they take advantage of it to foster economic development. Whereas for bad institutions, it leads to a further increase in moral hazards, mismanagement on the part of the government, and bad economic policies. This brings us to the end of this lesson. But before we go, let's take a quick summary on what we have learned so far. We learned that economic development can be defined as an improvement in the economic, political, and social well-being of a people. We also learned that economic development challenges refer to those issues that hinder an improvement in the well-being of a people. Finally, we learned the challenges of economic development, which include poverty, unemployment, power and energy inadequacy. Now let's take some questions to know how much we have learned so far. Question 1. Dash is an improvement in the economic, political, and social well-being of a people. A. Economic development. B. Economic growth. Or C. Economic development challenges. The correct answer is A. Economic development. Question 2. All but one is not an economic development challenge. A. Poverty. B. Employment. C. Power and energy inadequacy. The correct answer is B. Employment. We have now come to the end of this class. I'm sure by now you can define economic development and explain its challenges. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.